So, ladies and gentlemen, we will now be treated to a wonderful lecture by Dr. Sharon Sibanda. To say a little bit about Dr. Sibanda. Dr. Sibanda began her career as a clinical psychologist in the South African Military Health Services, providing psychological care to soldiers and their families. She later joined the Department of Military Veterans, where she assessed neuropsychiatric impairments among veterans resulting from combat exposure for compensation purposes. Dr. Sibanda also served as the GPPAA Medical Appeals Board, evaluating trauma-related pension claims for military veterans, and from 2018 to 2023 lectured at the University of Pretoria and is currently a senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg, where she teaches undergraduate and postgraduate students and supervises postgraduate research. It's wonderful to hear that this is a growing area of research among students. Her research focuses on trauma studies, particularly complex trauma within South Africa's socio-historical context, and she has published on racial trauma and combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. Her PhD explored traumatization among Black SANDF soldiers and culminated in her wonderful book, which we launched here at the museum earlier in the year in April, titled Ghanaian, The Untold Stories of Unresolved Psychological Wounds of Combat After South Africa's Demobilization Among Black SANDF Soldiers. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Sibanda.
Ladies and gentlemen, protocol observed. It's a profound honor for me to open this exhibition celebrating the immense contributions of women who contributed to our liberation. Join me in honoring the strength, sacrifice, resilience of female activists and combatants. I've titled my talk, Echoes of Courage, the Emotional Imprint of Women in the Liberation Struggle. So this title challenges dominant histories that often overlook the personal costs of conflict. It reflects deep engagement with emotional and psychological legacies carried by female soldiers and activists whose life stories we honor today. This is just a picture. I recently had the opportunity to visit the Nelson Mandela Museum in Mthatha, and I was mulling over this presentation, not knowing where to take it, because my age group, I fall in a funny age group when it comes to identifying with these women, though I embody their courage. So this is Mama Winnie, and yeah. So this slide here, this is just how I put this together. This is just my stream of consciousness, and I'm also led by titles that you find in literature, books that are written by female scholars. So when we look at the indelible marks of freedom, just defining what I mean by the concept of emotional imprint. For me, this term refers to the indelible marks that traumatic experiences leave on individuals, especially these women. It captures how deeply these experiences influence their emotional state, behavior, personal narratives, and resilience. So the overall narrative seeks to evoke empathy and understanding regarding their silent battles with trauma, while simultaneously emphasizing their collective strength. There's a collective urgent need for us to acknowledge and support the women who fought for freedom and yet continued to fight for recognition and healing in post-apartheid South Africa. And titles like The Invisible Wounds of War, Female Soldiers, Narratives of Trauma and Struggle underscore the necessity of bringing light to these often neglected narratives. So these women grappled with the psychological scars and unseen burdens of combat. This reflects the dual journey of navigating their roles as combatants. The exhibition explores the comprehensive nationwide journey of female combatants and activists. I want to take a moment just to root our conversation in a specific personal reality, the reality of growing up in Soweto as a young girl. for me, Soweto was not just a segregated area. It defined by forces of colonialism and apartheid. It was a living ecosystem where the legacies of struggle permeated every aspect of daily life. There was a strip in Soweto where when you drive past somewhere around Orlando, grown-ups in the taxi would always point to, that is Nelson Mandela's house, and then conversations would begin in the taxi. So this, as kids, was transmitted to us by the stories that, we saw around, but there was a silence also in the intergenerational transmission of these women's resilience. So the narrative of Soweto often touches on the enduring impact of a segregated society and the personal experiences of police brutality. But what struck me most profoundly was the resilience of the women who held communities together. These are women also who were left behind. I come back to Soweto because I also want us not to forget the unsung heroes, being the women who made sure that there was still cohesion within families. People went to exile, leaving families behind. When I say people, in this point, men were arrested, women had to flee, families, children were left behind. And there were women in Soweto, these mamas, who became mothers to all these households. So as a little girl, I was raised in an environment whose heartbeat was to the rhythm of the resilience of these women left behind. So these were the mothers, sisters, grandmothers who ensured that families and actually communities were not fragmented. Their battles were fought far from the front lines, yet they were fundamentally intertwined with the liberation efforts. These were women who tended to the wounds, right? I was raised around women who were tasked with tending to the wound of collective pain, the collective pain that we still endures in our country's history, right? And what does it mean? What did it mean, at least at the time, to tend to the wound? And these were assignments that these women took on without being directed. They needed to just step into certain roles as a result of the struggle. So this, in my musings, meant managing the internal wounds of those who fought the apartheid regime within the country. It meant dealing with the psychological fallout of a struggle that demanded everything, not just from the soldiers, but from families they left behind and those that they returned to as empty shells of themselves. I again come back to the silence. There was something of a silenced suffering here, right? So this experience offers a unique lens onto the concepts we are reflecting on today as we walk through the exhibition, particularly the emotional imprint, right? So here I play on the word, and just, it's not even a wording. It's something that I think, we still, when we say there's a lot of trauma in our country, this is the stuff of it. So what exactly do I mean today by this emotional imprint? I'm referring to these indelible marks, enduring traumatic marks that these traumatic experiences left on these individuals. These were communities having to survive and rise above the trauma. So in Soweto, these marks were not always visible. The women I grew up around were the bedrock who absorbed this pain, dealt with trauma of loss of their own children as well, who were in exile or who would be detained never to be seen again. Absence, violence, and yet maintained strength. A kind of strength that is often overlooked in traditional military histories. While we must evoke empathy and understanding regarding their silent battles with trauma, we must simultaneously emphasize their collective strength. This is the very definition of the environment I was raised in. The women's resilience fueled the community's spirit. I was not simply an observer of this resilience. I was implanted on the emotional footprints, I'd say, of psychological and spiritual warriors. So I stand here before you today, on the shoulders of these giants. This implantation means that I inherited a profound intuitive understanding of the issues we explore in this exhibition. So my personal experience just helps us illuminate the need to address the unseen burdens and the psychological scars of combat that these women carried, and often alone. The narratives of the invisible wounds of war, this body of work captures how this was so a lived reality in Soweto, even for those who never held a gun. This underscores the dual struggle that I witnessed firsthand, and that is that of the emotional complexity involved when women soldiers returned home, having to balance their identity as a combatant with the demands of family and often being single mothers. So this struggle, I speak of it as hearts under fire, was a defining feature of life in the communities of Soweto, where men and women had been away fighting. So being raised by those tasked with tending to the wound of collective pain continues to fuel the resilient spirit in me. It is that resilient spirit, born of the heart of Soweto, that today allows me to honor these women. And I hope that I have and will continue to make them proud, since I am now the face of the museum, of the exhibition. So healing. And here I want to touch on, just briefly, on how ultimately my upbringing informed my appreciation for the urgent need for epistemic and testimonial justice for women who fought for freedom, most of whom continue to fight for recognition and healing in post-apartheid South Africa. So these women grappled with the psychological scars and unseen burdens of combat they were expected to carry on, right? This reflects a dual journey of having to navigate their roles as combatants or ex-combatants and the subsequent internal resources that they would have required to heal, right? To achieve some sort of psychological integration within post-conflict South Africa. It's as though we did not leave room for these women to really become who were they meant to become. So I agree with scholars who say that South Africa's road to democracy could have suffered a stillbirth had it not been the unseen role played by women. Our democracy cannot be complete without the untold stories of undercover operations played by women during and after the Rivonia arrests. It is a fact that after 1963, the leadership of both organizations, namely the ANC, SACF, and MK, were behind bars. So as a result, there was virtually a complete destruction of internal leadership structures. And the struggle for democracy nearly suffered a stillbirth had it not been for the untold undercover operations of some women and men who stood firm and courageous to complete the struggle. The story of South Africa's road to democracy cannot be complete without considering the contributions made by women who galvanized and reconstituted political organization through undercover operations. Let us discover and reposition contributions by women like Albertina Sisulu, Ruth Mpati, Joyce Kakane, amongst others. Through their undercover operations, complementary efforts to complete the story of South Africa's road to democracy. Another striking example I came across is that of Joyce Kakane, who was a journalist who was free to move about without attracting attention at the time. She was sought out by many political activists to help them with passing messages from one person to another. Albertina Sisulu, Helen Joseph also assisted in setting up certain meetings. Toilets in the Westgate Station, Faraday stations were used as meeting places. To expand the narrative around women who played pivotal roles in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, let us also rediscover several sung and unsung figures alongside Mama Winnie Mandela, who exemplified both resilience and a commitment to justice in their contribution. Just here, just an expansion of their narratives, both with pioneers, combatants, and unsung heroes, just looking at their contributions. So, and these are, but sure, it's not, it actually, because I've been to the exhibition, I see some of the ladies I mentioned here are mentioned here, and some think it's continuous work that need to be added on to the exhibition. So there's, in terms of her contribution, Elizabeth Mafeking was a pioneer of resistance. She dedicated her life to the anti-apartheid struggle. She at least lived to see the system crumble, validating the place of sacrifice, ensuring her children could live with dignity and respect. She passed away at the age of 90 at her home in Bekweni in the Western Cape, the home of her heart and the land of her birth. Winnie Mandela, also alongside her pioneer of resilience, we know that she was known for her tireless efforts and ability to mobilize communities against the systemic oppression of apartheid, often facing arrest and harassment for her start. Her resilience inspires many across the world today. And Mama Albertina Sisulu, for her kindness, acknowledge her for her contribution in shaping political discourse. She was a leader within the ANC and a key figure in the Women's League. She was involved in various initiatives aimed at empowering women in the liberation struggle. Advocating for their rights and the notion that women should be central to the fight against oppression. She worked as a nurse and in the clinics when people came to consult. Actually, that is when the underground operations information was exchanged amongst activists. And then Joseph was a guardian. I coin it here contributions as the guardian of heritage. As a founding member of the Federation of South African Women, Joseph was crucial in leading protests and campaigns, particularly the historic March of 1956 against the passports. She remained steadfast advocate for racial and gender equality throughout her life. Fatima Mia, she was a combatant and an activist, an anti-apartheid activist and writer. Contributions included organizing protests against apartheid policies and advocating for rights regarding the intersectionality of race and gender within the liberation struggle. Lilian Ngoyi was also known for mobilizing for dignity. She was the first woman elected to the ANC's National Executive Committee and led significant campaigns, including the Women's March. She fought tirelessly for women's rights and worked to include those within the broader anti-apartheid narrative. I'm just looking at unsung heroes before I wrap up. One of them, this is just only two out of so many, Nokuthula Wetlung. She was a resolute MK soldier when he was engaged in clandestine operations fighting against apartheid. Her commitment to the struggle, coupled with the risks she faced, exemplifies the courageous spirit of women in armed liberation movements. She ultimately lost her life in detention under mysterious circumstances. The story is a stark reminder of the sacrifices made by women whose contributions were largely unrecognized. There's also Ruth First, who was also a brave dissenter, a journalist and an anti-apartheid activist. She was involved with the liberation movement. We saw her documenting the struggles and atrocities faced by South Africans under apartheid. Eventually, she became a target and was murdered for her work. First narratives exemplified the dangers faced by women fighting for justice and the critical role that women played in the struggle. So through these women's contributions, a clearer picture emerges of how female activists not only participated significantly in the armed struggle against apartheid, but also shaped our political discourse, mobilizing communities and addressing pressing social issues impacting daily lives. Each of these figures underscores the themes of resilience, empowerment, and the pivotal role of women in the quest for freedom and dignity in South Africa. So the emotional imprint is profoundly shaped not only by trauma, but also by courage and resilience. So the transformative journey is captured by texts such as From Shadows to Healing, Women's Resilience in the Aftermath of the Armed Struggle. This journey speaks to their strength to reclaim their narratives. It calls for a collective understanding of their experiences, promoting healing and a sense of belonging in a society that too often overlooks their immense sacrifices and contributions. We must acknowledge the visible strength and the emotional imprint left by their profound commitment, agency, and belief in a free South Africa. Look closely at these echoes. They represent the spirit of psychological and spiritual warriors whose resilience endures. As we move through this exhibition today, please listen deeply for these echoes of courage and honor their continuous fight for recognition and healing, even of those no longer with us, as their children bear the brunt of intergenerationally transmitted combat traumatization.
It is indeed an honor to come and share some of what our research is all about. And some of the questions that were raised earlier may be touching on what I'm going to be presenting. And particularly that my talk might be expanding on Dr. Sibanda's presentation as she focused on the internal. And mine It does focus on the internal, but it also mainly focusing on those that left the country into exile, receiving military training, and that's where our focus is going to be. My talk is subdivided into these 5 topics. I'm not going to do justice to each of them because each one of those, they are, extensive on their own. I'm going to look at the contextualization of women participation in the armed struggle, the tough choices and the hard decisions they had to make, which was the reason for them to join the armed struggle. Their experiences, all the way from the time that they leave the country to the time when they return back home, which will also be transferred to homecoming. What did they experience when they are back home? And lastly, the legacies, which is what the youth have been asking questions this morning about. The legacy. And that is what you have to build on. They left a torch. It should not die in your hands. It's up to you what to do with it. You are attending this lecture this afternoon in order for you to take something and make it a point that it does not die. We gather today to reflect on a chapter of our history that is often overshadowed, but vital to our understanding of liberation, which is the role of the young women in the struggle for freedom in our country. The focus is on young women because the majority of those that left were in their teen years. They left school to go and join the liberation armies in exile. To them, they left with the song, "Give me my AK, Aule Tumshinwam," so that they can come and confront what was killing their classmates, their schoolmates, to return fire with fire. There were women that were also in exile, who were out of their teen years, who went with their husbands. There were women that left having been sent by their unions to go and receive training to come and build the underground structures. And then you would have women that remained behind. And the struggle for liberation was colorblind. We have to emphasize that. There were people that the apartheid system intended them to be the beneficiaries. But because of Ubuntu, they could see that injustice is injustice. Whether you do it on a wrong or rather a black skin or a white skin, injustice remains injustice. And they left to join this movement. Women's role dates back to the wars of resistance to colonization since 1779. Across Southern Africa and beyond, liberation movements relied not only on men, but also on the bravery, resilience, and dedication of young women who risked their lives and sacrificed the best years of their lives for the vision of a free nation. These were the women who, in the face of danger, fear, and uncertainty, chose courage over comfort, action over silence, and freedom over submission. They remind us that the liberation struggle was and is everyone's responsibility. As the saying goes, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes a duty. These women left for exile with scars, pain and bruises, dispossessed of land, denied access to land through the 1913 Land Act and the Bantu Administration or Authorities Act 1953, among others. Their mothers were denuded of dignity by being called kitchen girls and tea girls, forever displaced because of the forced removals, to be wanderers in the land of their ancestors. They left with the courage of Mama Mantatisi, Madinore, Sarah Bartman, Krotwa, the courage of the 20,000 women who marched onto the Union buildings on August 9, 1956. The courage of women in every corner of the country who faced daily struggles to navigate through the system that placed them at the bottom or lowest rung of the racial and gender ladder, regarded by law as perpetual minors. Their resilience proved that courage is an inside job. They left with the hope of healing the land, but they knew to take out a thorn, you needed another thorn. It was this pain, the scars, the shame that provided two choices to them: submit or fight. It was their will to heal the land of their birth that made them to take the hard decisions and opted to fight. With these experiences, they stood by the hard decisions they made because they were convinced the yoke of oppression would be broken and to the benefit of those to come after them. South African history is written in blood, including the blood of unarmed women killed fighting for injustice, protection of their children, and fight to put a bread on their table. By the 1970s, South Africa was not a safe place because of the unfettered powers of the police, whose duty outside of the white areas was not for crime prevention, but to enforce the plethora of discriminatory laws through excessive use of force, early morning raids, arbitrary detention, torture, disappearances, and murder, which they claimed was due to a hunger strike or concealed through various other means. The state violence, which reached its highest proportions in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, was responsible for breeding anger in the younger generations who grew up in the state-perpetuated violence with impunity. They were condemned at birth by the Population Registration Act, denied quality education to develop humanity by the Bantu Education Act, and the 1975 forced language policy to introduce Afrikaans as the medium of instruction in black schools. They fled the country with full knowledge that their actions contravened the Terrorism Act, which would be reinforced by the Internal Security Act in 1982. Despite the educational opportunities that were available to them and were presented to them in exile, they continued to make tough choices and hard decisions by opting to join the military because their individual and collective desire to free the country of the scourge that the country and the majority of the people had endured for centuries. Because to them, liberation could not be postponed any longer. The system that pushed them out of the country united humanity, even those that apartheid was intended to be beneficiaries. They revolted and became combatants. For that, they joined liberation armies of Umkhonto weSizwe, APLA, and Azanla. And from the hostile bushes in foreign lands, as consolation and reminder of their commitment, they sang, Soba Shia abazali ekhaya, saphuma sangena angamanye amazwe, lapho ngingazi ukhona ubaba lomama, ngilande inkululeko. This was so because, like I said, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. The challenges and hardships started when they had to flee the country. The journey was not smooth, as they had to navigate and avoid the ring of steel that stood ready to capture them. Crossing the border was as dangerous as danger itself, as some had to cross the overflowing Mohokare River, which is Caledon, between South Africa and Lesotho, when they crossed into Lesotho. And you can think of any other border that these young women had to cross. Young women then, but today they are not young women. Safety and survival in the neighboring countries wasn't guaranteed either, as the Flag Plus unit reigned and roamed freely in Lesotho and Swaziland, abducting and killing the activists and innocent nationals of those countries that were under assault. In the camps, they learned the tough and uncompromising military routine and culture. They were exposed to harsh camp living conditions, sharing the space with the wildlife. When you listen to their stories, they will tell you that there will be a time that they wake up in the morning and they find that they are sleeping with a snake. And they had to sleep or to pretend to be sleeping, not to move in their bed until 1 o'clock midday, when the snake would have made its mind that, okay, it's time for me to leave. That's when they would leave, because any movement would invite a deadly strike from the snake. That was what they shared with the wild. These conditions continue to follow them in the forward areas where they will be deployed, where they faced diseases, living under constant fear of the South African Air Force and the Special Forces raids, leaving them with psychological stress from witnessing violence and ambushes from UNITA, loss of comrades, and experiencing abuse in certain instances. Being female combatant did not make them immune from the persisting patriarchal attitudes, where they had to work twice as hard to prove their worth as soldiers of the liberation and to fit in the men's environment. The extended separation from home naturally resulted in homesickness. For a teenager, grow without parental guidance and family support, that meant that they were the disadvantaged, thus robbed of their youth experiences. Falling pregnant meant they were removed from the military camps and confined to Morogoro, where their status as soldiers was temporarily suspended until the Kabwe Conference of 1985, where women raised their concerns to say we left home to become soldiers. We cannot be denied this natural thing that occurs to us, that we can fall pregnant. Is it a sin to fall pregnant? Because once you fall pregnant, in MK in particular, you are no longer a soldier. The 1985 Morogoro Conference brought them back, and some of them were infiltrated back into the country. These conditions left them with emotional and psychological traumas of comrades dying and buried in foreign lands, and sometimes they were buried in already used graves, buried in top of others, making it possible that in future, should there be repatriation, it was going to be difficult because there will be 2 remains or even 3 in that grave. This tormented them to think that the same could happen to them should they die in exile. Overstay in exile also had its fair share in their frustrations and emotional being. The movement's inability to deploy them back into the country, in consideration of the situation in the country and the high number of casualties to those that were deployed, caused a strain to them that it defeated the purpose for them to leave the country in the first place. But it also meant prolonged stay away from their families. They are being separated from their families, and some of them left the country leaving 3-month-old children in certain instances because they were the wanted, and the parents would say, "You are not safe. Go away. I'll take care of the child." Despite these challenges, they demonstrated remarkable resilience, creating networks of support and ensuring continuity of the struggle. With negotiations, they came back home. Returning home was possibly the hardest for most of them. Instead of bringing joy of returning with to be rejoined with their families and friends, they returned home not with a triumphant march to Pretoria, emulating their popular Toy Toy song, Siaya Epitoli. But when they returned home, some came to find their homes desolate. They came home being granted immunity by the government they were fighting against. Immunity from prosecution because they were regarded as terrorists. Some found their families having been relocated, some with no place to sleep in the house. Life in exile made them to survive as a unit where they cared for each other. Once they returned home, unfortunately and sadly, it was everybody for herself and God for us all, as the English saying goes. They left, some of them, grade 7, grade 8 of today, grade 9 of today. Therefore, they had no formal educational qualifications. They did not pursue educational qualifications in exile. Thus, they returned home with the same grade that they left. Coming home, they knew military for all these years that they were in exile. They wanted to join the military, but they were told there was no place around the fire. You do not qualify because you have got standard 4. We need someone who has got metric. Whose fault was it? That was the reintegration process. It spit them out. Once they are out, they are regarded as terrorists, unqualified terrorists that were now forced to compete for jobs with the recently qualified people in a sea of unemployment. From 1990, we had sanctions back then. The country was still reeling from that, and therefore they could not get employment because they had this tag. Where are you from? You are in exile. Therefore, you are a terrorist. To try to address their plight, they tried a collaborative approach by forming military veterans associations. Finally, in 2011, their voice seemed to be heard when the government passed the Military Veterans Act and established the Department of Military Veterans. Just when they thought their plight was heard, it remained a dream, because 14 years after the passing of the Military Veterans Act, there are still those veterans that haven't received any benefit from it. People that did not fight, they are the ones that are enjoying the benefits. And therefore, where it's recognition for them, where it's dignity for them, they went out to try to salvage the little dignity that they had. But today, they sit here without that. The tough choices and difficult decisions were the highest form of patriotism a nation can ever get from its daughters. Their participation led to a change in the tapestry on the political landscape and social history of South Africa. Gains of their toil and sweat are there to be seen. Gender recognition. South Africa is now a pace setter when it comes to issues of gender, and various other gender policies passed to correct the past wrongs. Women's participation in the liberation war reshaped societal expectations of gender roles and gave new meaning to a citizen woman. The struggle was for a place under the sun. The struggle was for survival. Their struggle was for equality. Their struggle was for justice. This is the torch they have left, and not to die in someone's hands. There is a growing need for oral histories to capture their stories, memorialization of their courage and resilience, and there is a need for intergenerational dialogue to keep their stories and contribution alive into the future. But a begging question arises: has the life of an ordinary South African woman changed in 2025? How different is the life of an ordinary South African woman from the tough choices and the hard decisions the young women of 1963, 1976, 1984 were forced to take? In my view, it is a luta continua. As I conclude, young female students, tough choices they faced, tough decisions they had to make. They became combatants when they should have been at school. Some barely out of their teens. They took the responsibility that was way out of their pay grade, but they rose up to the challenge to take up only that which heroes do. As Steve Biko said, it is better to die for an idea that will live than to live for an idea that will die. The yoke that they wanted to break, which at the time seemed to be as solid as a rock, was finally broken. The world witnessed the birth of a new country. And out of the ashes of decades of torture and degradation, like a phoenix, South Africa rose. The world listened in 1994 and watched what will forever echo in their minds. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. Thank you. It's an honor really to speak on this subject that many other people are more qualified to speak about. For example, the actual participants, and of course, the men that they shared the trenches with, who experienced the first-hand, the uncompromising harsh conditions in the bushes of Angola, Tanzania, Uganda, and elsewhere where they were deployed and survived malaria, the venomous snakes of Angola, food poisoning, the Air Force raids, ambushes, and many other dangers that were always lurking around them. If we are to move to the second slide, the background to this topic, aspects of the experiences of 10 women in MK, 1976 to 1988, is the title of my MA study, which I completed at the University of Johannesburg. The study sought to investigate the presence of women in MK, their role in that particular period. In the end, I settled on focusing on experiences as the most appropriate aspect that I needed to research on. A Google search for 10 MK soldiers at the time of the conception of my study yielded 1 or 2 women, among whom were Matandimudise and Marion Spark, both of whom are the products of this period. It was this that inspired my topic further, a quest to check for other women who were omitted, not from fame, but history, and also in obscurity towards oblivion for their crucial journey and the painful journey that the country went through. It is said that some of them, even their children, have faded memories on the role their mothers played in the struggle. These are the women that, as Marion Spark alluded to earlier, they are ordinary soldiers whose contribution and experiences have largely been ignored as we write the history of MK. Both Matandimudise and Marion Spark's names managed to find a way to Google because they were arrested for their activities as MK soldiers and were presented to the world as terrorists who happened to be women. An example of that was an article that was carried in Sunday Times of November 9, 1986, titled Portrait of a Terrorist Inside the Tortured Mind of Marion Spark. Tandimudise was sentenced to 16 years, 8 years that ran concurrently after her arrest in 1979 and charged under the Terrorism Act as well as Sabotage Act. She had earlier left her home, Vryburg, in 1976 at the age of 17. They were together a group of 10, 6 boys and 4 girls, when they left for Botswana in a quest to receive military training because of the unprovoked police harassment at school as the reason that she advanced. The study had women as its focus, but in reality, most were still in their teens and still needed parental care, guidance, and family support. In the group that left together with Thandi Modise in 1976, the youngest was a boy of 13 and a girl of 15. I must, however, indicate that there were others who left the country when they were university students, and others were in another careers and were much older. The period under discussion this morning did not occur in a vacuum. It was preceded by many years of hardships and resistance by women against the colonial system which destroyed the African political, military, economic, and value systems, which, in the words of Elizabeth Landis, had created a spacious version of African traditions, which is convenient for the white purposes and has foisted it on the blacks as the old-time culture by which they must abide. After the destruction of the family structure through migrant labor system, women were condemned to stay in rural areas, which the government called reserves, without access to land, and were barred through the pass system from going anywhere near the urban areas, which Landis again correctly states that the government officials recognized the homemaking role of women and feared that their presence in the cities would lead to the establishment of stable black population. The 1960 Sharpeville shootings and other resistance attempts were a culmination of many years of a call by African majority as if to say, take off your knee, we cannot breathe. The period 1976 to 1988 saw the country shedding its young people, fleeing from the irresponsible government that was supposed to protect and shape them to be productive members and citizens of the country. With its actions, the government had abdicated its responsibilities to provide what I call 8 cardinal services of education, employment opportunities and entrepreneurship, health and well-being, civic and engagement, social services, cultural and recreational opportunities, access to information, but most importantly, safety protection, which they conveniently replaced with a shoot to kill policy. Because of this carelessness of the government of the day, the young people were forced to take greater responsibilities on their shoulders never experienced before, the service of their motherland. Although the study is divided into 4 focus chapters, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on 2 chapters that speak directly to the experiences. What then drove these women at the age that they were to venture into the unknown? The unknown because they did not know where they were going, only driven by the desire to lay their hands on a gun to come back home and fight. This disrupted their lives as learners. Police and soldiers killed the scores of people that they knew as classmates, schoolmates, neighbors, or even siblings and relatives. They were going into the unknown, as one of the songs they sang, Sobashiya abazali ekhaya, saphuma sangena kwamanye amazwe, lapho kungazi khona ubaba nomama siladele inkululeko. Chapter 1 is based on the reasons for them to leave, and I titled it To Go or Not Yet to Go, Why They Left. This chapter has got 3 main reasons: in search of security, recruitment, political education. I saw it fit to start the chapter with a biblical scripture from 2 Kings, chapter 7, verses 3 to 4, because I found this relevant to the situation the people found themselves at the time. The scripture says, "Why should we wait here till we die? It is no use going into the city, because we would starve to death in there. But if we stay here, we will die also. So let us go to the Syrian camp. The worst they can do is kill us, but maybe they will spare our lives." The South African government was notorious for not valuing black lives. Bloodshed was a regular occurrence whenever African people protested against government policies. The safety of Africans was therefore not guaranteed, and the events of the morning of Wednesday, 16 June 1976, did not prove any different. The chapter To Go or Not to Go categorized, as I indicated, under the 3. Now, in search of security as the reason. The genesis of the need for security was the shooting of learners and the subsequent follow-up police arrests of those who were regarded as troublemakers. With schooling disrupted, the police thought they would return things to normalcy by removing the ringleaders from the community. This resulted in people not staying at home and changing sleeping places every night as they continued with night raids. An example is Ayanda Dlodlo, whose nom de guerre was Mabel Clinia, who was involved in student politics in Orlando West High as a leader in the SRC and SASCO. Because of her role as a student leader, she was regarded as an instigator for the school boycotts in the area, leading her to be sought by police. When she managed to evade arrest in 1982 by hiding in a laundry basket in a neighbor's house, she felt that the only way left for her, if she were to survive, was to leave the country. Those who had relatives outside the township areas, as the concentration of the 1976 was in the township, they sent their children to the homelands, where some continued with their schooling until they completed their matric. The 1980s were different because even the homelands were affected. Due to the propaganda machinery of the time, students who came originally from the PWV region at the time were tagged as possible instigators and viewed with suspicion by the country forces in self-governing territories to universities. This was mostly evidenced in the Transkei, which led to serious discomfort and deep sense of insecurity among the students studying at the university. With such insecurity, her search for personal security drove Portia Sibiya to abandon her studies towards a medical degree at the University of the Transkei in Umtata in 1985 to join MK. Because of the police crackdown to deal with the instigators, or the Ditlebgooiers as they called them, a pattern developed of disappearances without trace of comrades in the hands of police. The thought of being bundled into a police van to never see your family again always sent a chilling feeling down the spine of most township young people. Many therefore felt it was better to leave the country to receive military training than to disappear at the hands of the police like others did. Another aspect still under in search of security that drove people was the arrests, the torture, and the unabated police harassment to individuals, to families, and even relatives that were known to police. Gloria Meek, a former student and a member of the South African Student Organization, in an interview that was conducted in exile by Hilda Bernstein, indicated that after her first arrest in 1975, she decided to leave the country in 1976 because life became a hassle for her after she was required to report at John Foster police station every day at 6 p.m. At times when she failed to report, she would sleep at different places as she knew the police would look for her. That, coupled with torture that she was subjected to while in jail, caused her to choose to leave the country. Gloria explained the reason for leaving the country and joined MK as follows. I didn't want to become a vegetable, what we used to call some of these people who were detained and tortured all the times, up to a point where you are totally useless. In relation to torture that she suffered, Gloria had this to say. They used to beat me up. At one stage, they even beat me up at the back of my head with a baton or a pistol. And they used to make me undress and stand naked in front of them for hours on end, sometimes from morning until late at night. I would stand there and I was expected to incriminate some of my fellow students that I was active in the movement with. Explaining the kind of torture she was subjected to, she stated as follows. Well, there was one particular time when they had some bricks made out of metal in the shape of bricks, 2 bricks which they would plug into some electrical device, and these bricks would freeze. She would be made to stand on those bricks about 12 hours until she collapsed. She was further beaten and her hair pulled out of the roots. What was more humiliating was that all this were done to her while she was stuck naked. The disturbing story about Gloria's experience was made worse by the fact that all this torture happened when she was 3 months pregnant. And when she had a miscarriage in the prison cell because of the torture, she was made to clean up herself. She received no medical treatment after that. She felt her stay in the country was not contributing anything to the struggle, but only leaving her with personal suffering. The experience of women were varied, just like the victims were. Among these were those who left the country after having lost their siblings, killed by police. Mavis Nhlapo was one such woman who lost her 16-year-old younger brother during the 1976 riots. With this experience, Mavis felt an urge to pursue the cause that her brother died for by leaving the country. She stated that if I continued to study under the educational system that he had been killed fighting against, then I would not be fulfilling his wishes. As it was the practice of the security forces during that time, because of the political affiliations of the dead boy, her family was put under constant harassment. Mavis further retorts, you can imagine how it was. A child has been killed by the police, and they tried to make his family account for his death. The Nhlapo family feared for the safety of the remaining children. Mavis, who was 21 at the time, had dropped out of Fort Hare University after she was expelled for political activities. She left the country in September 1976, together with her 3 surviving siblings, via the underground route and arrived in Lusaka, Zambia. For Caesarina Konamakwere, whose nomdigere was Rose Mukwena, whose father was a policeman, It was the brutality of fellow students by police that made her to plan to leave the country. But unfortunately, her attempts were thwarted when she was arrested and sentenced for 6 years for attempting to leave the country for military training. While in prison, she met Thandi Modise, that she came to learn that he was a trained military MK soldier, and that only inspired her and strengthened the resolve that upon her release, she will leave the country. When she was released, her comrades told her that her life was in danger, and with the assistance of people like Dr. Fabian Ribeiro, she left the country via Botswana using a Transkei passport. There were others who were advised by their parents to leave the country for their own safety, which was the case with Olga Mangwazana. Mangwazana, though, was not the only case falling in this category, because there were many others. There was also a case of Mabena Mutlatlani Faith, whose combat name was Ntabiseni. She was arrested in 1985 at the age of 14 while doing Form 3. During her arrest, she was beaten by police to force her to confess to something that she did not know. She was left for dead and dropped in the bush between Orlando and New Canada while still unconscious. When she regained consciousness, she found herself in Mozambique, having been rescued by people that, to this day, she does not know. She was subsequently raised by a family in Mozambique, where she attended school at Josina Machel School. She abandoned her schooling in 1987 to join MK. Detention and torture of women came with an added disadvantage. The methods that were employed by male police officers to force women to confess were dehumanizing. The women who survived the torture at the hands of the police felt humiliated, which left permanent scars in their minds, both as women and victims. This added the reasons for some of them to want to leave the country for military training. It goes without saying that the police brutality only bred anger instead of fear, which the police hoped to instill in the students. Thandi Modise was one of those who cited anger as the reason for her to leave the country, and she had this to say: "It was difficult to wait, watching your brothers and schoolmates mauled down." A direct answer she gave to the question why she left the country. She said, "Lot of anger. And the killings and all this made me develop hatred. Nothing was too risky considering the sickening tyranny that was taking place in South Africa and in the Bantustans like Bophuthatswana." The then 12-year-old Pamela Daniels, we are still on that slide. We'll move to this one a bit later. Pamela Daniels, whose combat name was Nombeko, was 12 years old and dreamt to become a lawyer. She decided to leave the country after she was arrested and was granted bail. And out of fear of facing long prison sentence, she decided to leave the country, like I said, at the age of 12. When she arrived in Tanzania, she was offered an option of going to school on account of her age. But instead, she opted to receive military training. It was this anger that drove her, like many others, to join MK. She says that because of anger and what she experienced in the township, she did not want anything to do with education, except to get an AK-47 and come back home to fight the enemy. The fear for their safety was not founded. The TRC, which was set 20 years after the 1976 riots, It reported that 575 people were killed and 2,380 people were injured in clashes between the protesters and members of the SAP during the 1976 uprising. Another source records that between June 1976 and October 1977, 700 people were killed, an average of 44 people a month. From the upsurge in September 1984 until the end of 1989, that average monthly death was almost double to 86 per month. We can now move to recruitment slide. The underground structures played a crucial role in recruiting the students, but also for their safety as well, as it had become dangerous to live inside the country, as evidenced in the previous paragraph. Such structures knew methods and routes on how to send the recruits out of the country and to avoid arrests on the way to exile. While others left without passports, there were others who left with passports organized by members of these underground structures, some of whom were not suspected for underground activities as they continued to perform their normal daily duties. Radio freedom was also crucial in popularizing the African National Congress and encouraging the young people to join Umkhonto we Sizwe. In addition, the ANC had publications like Sechaba, Dawn, and others, which were infiltrated into the country. They helped in conscientizing the people by recruiting them when they knew they could leave the country and contribute to its liberation. One such person who was influenced by these publications was Mami Mngakato, who today is a lieutenant general in the SNDF. Her combat name was Mary Dlamini. She had access to the publications because her grandmother was an ANC underground operative during the time. As I indicated, another reason would be political consciousness. After 1976, educational institutions became institutions for political consciousness through student organizations. The establishment and calls for the establishment of SRCs played a critical role in conscientizing the students with slogans like freedom now, education later. When student boycotts increased, so did police brutality. The 1980s saw intense brutality, and this increased the number of people who left the country as well as women. The political situation in the country during the period 1976 to 1986 was the chief motivator for women to join MK in exile. Women who mostly were still of school-going age felt unsafe within the country and decided it was their responsibility and turn to stand up and do something. They reacted by fleeing the country in order to receive military training, to enable them to come back home and fight the system rather than to surrender. We can move to chapter 2, challenges. The challenges that they experienced were on leaving the country, en route, in the camps, and out of the camps. Women who left the country faced numerous challenges that some argue helped them to make them stronger and to cope in a military environment. Where you were on your own, and they were forced to create and foster the spirit of unity and sisterhood amongst themselves, which they still maintain to this day. After leaving home and arriving in the neighboring countries, they only got some relief when they surrendered to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, or police stations in the host countries before they made a choice as to which movement between the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress they wanted to join. Once in the hands of the movement of their choice, they were given choices whether to go to school or to join the military. The movements preferred women to choose school because in the view of these movements, they wanted people with education to come and rebuild the country after liberation. But because of the anger that engulfed these women and the experiences back home, majority of them opted for military training. As I have alluded to, the challenges that they experienced would be how to leave home, the threat of being abused along the way, male domination in the camps, nostalgia, absence of parental guidance and family support, high number of pregnancies, hard living conditions, shortages of supplies, and lack of counseling, among others. Can we move to the next slide on leaving the country? The first challenge was to leave the country and arrive safely to an unknown land and how to join MK once they are there. The security police were on high alert after discovering that the youth were leaving the country in large numbers, and there were occasional roadblocks any time of the day, any time of the night. Not everyone who planned to leave had transport organized for them. Not everyone who planned to leave had a passport organized for them. Neither did anyone or everyone had money for the journey when they left home. They had to devise own means to reach their destination safely, avoiding arrest on the way. Some organized themselves in groups of more than two, like Thandimulise did. They left no messages for the family when they left, and they connected with the underground structures for transport that will take them to the border. Even if transport was arranged for their departure, unless they had proper documentation, they had to cross the border into Swaziland or Lesotho or Botswana on foot. In Botswana, it earned them the name Matulatarata, meaning those who jumped the fence. The advantage of those that left with the help of the underground structures was that there were always contacts on the other side of the border to welcome them. Thandimulise's experience in leaving the country is as follows. We started working toward the Botswana border at 11 p.m. in July 1976 and crossed into Botswana at sunrise. We had one aim, military training. Konamakwere, Cesarina Konamakwere, had an interesting story to tell, which she believed helped her to avoid arrest on her journey to Botswana, as she was highly sought by the police in Mamelodi. She believed her safety all the way was credited to muti that she got from a traditional healer, which she constantly applied on her body while traveling, as ordered by the doctor, especially when she was nearing the border. She said when she reached Zeerust, there was a heavy police presence, but she believes that due to the muti that she applied, the police seemed to be asleep when she went past. This goes to show the attempts and the means that people were trying to avoid arrest, as long as they can manage to get out of the country because of the dangers that were lurking. For those who left through Mozambique, it was not easy because the country was on high alert. since it had just attained its independence from the Portuguese. There were times required to stay at the border with the soldiers for 2 weeks and staying at Frelimo headquarters for a further 2 months for questioning, because they could be suspected that they might be working for the Portuguese. Can we move to the second slide, another slide, threats of being abused? On their journey, the danger of being abused was always lurking from strangers they would meet. But on arrival in the camps, they were not immune to such dangers. MK had a very clear policy to try and deal with offenses committed by members, which also were aimed at protecting and creating a safe environment for the women members. In its code of conduct, under grave crimes against the struggle, sexual abuse was by any member against a fellow female comrade was regarded as a serious crime. The following were regarded and categorized as serious offenses in MK military code. There was Article 2F, which stated abusing office by using one's position to attain material or sexual or another undue advantage from members or others. 2K stated sexually assaulting or in any other way seriously offending the dignity of members. It further stated the code advocated equal treatment and respect for women as follows. 5E stated all members of Umkhonto weSizwe are friends and comrades. And 5F show respect to women folk. Despite these policies and official standpoint of MK and the ANC on the treatment of women in the Liberation Army, there were complaints of abuse. To try to stem this, Chris Hani came up with what became known as Rule 25. According to this rule, intimate relationships between commanders and new female recruits were viewed as being unfair and were thus discouraged. Can we move to male domination? The fewer numbers of women meant that there was male dominance, which the movement tried to manage through the clauses as we have indicated. The first area which some women felt males did not welcome them was when they were discouraged from joining the military and instead to opt to go to school. They felt men did not trust them to be freedom fighters. And once in the camps, there were times that life was difficult for women because some men undermined them. Whereas some of the female recruits felt that they were not treated well by their male counterparts, others felt that they did not experience problems. An example of those that felt they did not feel the indifference was Ayanda Dlodlo and Mamiya Kato. They expressed satisfaction in the way they were treated, both within the camps and outside. Once women realized their limitations, created by attitudes of some of the men, which made them feel pressure to work harder to prove themselves, an act which they felt was equivalent to their marginalization. They then decided to take the matter into their own hands by forming their own support teams from among their ranks. This move was criticized by men who viewed it as being divisive, reactionary, and the cause of friction within the camps, as Thandi Modise argued. This shows the extent to which women within MK struggled to fit into that environment, which was both male-dominated and made extra difficult for them. Can we move to the next slide? Nostalgia. Homesickness naturally comes naturally considering the age that most of them were still, which required parental care and guidance. The parents who were in exile were the only ones who knew of the whereabouts of their daughters because they were free to meet in exile. Having left home without telling their parents, their siblings or friends of their plans to leave the country, it left most of them feeling nostalgic during their stay in exile. This problem was compounded by lack of access to communication facilities in the camps. Even if they had communication facilities, for security reasons, it would have been dangerous for them to contact their families. This was in the interest of both them as individuals and their families back at home. Most female cadres indicated that they missed home and thought of their mothers every night. Sibia stated that to try and overcome this problem of feeling homesick, she meditated a lot to find her inner self. At times, she would lock herself the whole day, crying about home. They also had to rely on comrades to fill the gap of their absent families. The older women from the women's section tried to close this gap through their support. The commissariat, for their roles equivalent to those of social workers, caregivers, and counselors, also played a critical role. Those who were lucky would have meetings with their parents, arranged for them to meet them in Botswana. Others only managed to see their parents when they returned home in the 1990s, while others never had the opportunity because their parents, either both or one of them, had passed away while they were in exile. However, the cultural activities that were organized weekly also helped to cushion the pain. Can we move to the next slide? Most of them left the country while in their teens, when parental guidance was needed. Their departure severed ties with their families. Some, like Ngame Rachel Weziwe, admitted that they lacked and missed parental care and guidance. There were some women who had left children back at home. Their departure severed their maternal role, if one takes into account the maternal bond that normally exists between the mother and her child. This action continued even when the cadres whose children were with them in exile had to be deployed on official assignments and had to leave their children in Tanzania attended to by someone else. If we can move to the next slide on pregnancies. When women fell pregnant, it affected their life as soldiers as they were withdrawn and sent to Mazimbu in Tanzania, where they raised their children. It was a painful experience to them because they left home to become soldiers. But due to being pregnant and being mothers, they were no longer deemed suitable. It was only during the Kabwe Conference in 1985 that women moved for the relaxation of the rule and to allow women full participation in the military structures. On the other hand, they had a new responsibility of raising a child far away from home with no family support. The African National Congress established a facility in Mazimbu, which was later to become known as Solomon Mahlangu Freedom College. It was established to cater for education from preschool up to secondary level. A creche or nursery school named Charlotte Maxeke was part of the facilities that provided schooling for children and care for children at the Freedom College. Can we move to the next slide? The hard living conditions were not too welcoming. They had to adjust their sleeping patterns to sleep the military style and the requirements. Military camp life dictated certain patterns and activities. For example, they had to wake up at 4:30 in the morning, do morning exercises, take a bath within a limited period, and then prepare for the grueling military day. Coupled to this were other issues like shortages of supplies and foodstuffs, as well as health conditions. The ANC relied on donations from countries that were sympathetic and supported the struggle for liberation in managing their camps. Among the food that they ate were tinned food, beans, rice, milk, and all came from the Soviet Union and the German Democratic Republic. They also ate powdered milk, or rather powdered eggs, which they detested because it attracted flies. And at times the beans that they ate were worm infested. They also supplemented their diet with whatever could be killed when some male comrades went out to hunt. And this included baboon meat, infam, which they also ate. Another real threat was occasional food poisoning and the air raids by the South African Air Force in the earlier days before the camps could be relocated to the north, and also regular contacts with UNITA. Up to 1976, there was serious shortage of supplies to cater for women's needs. Obviously, the leadership of the African National Congress did not expect the influx they received following the 1976 uprisings, which included a large number of women, which they never experienced before. Some of the health problems that women experienced were related to water that they used. This, however, was kept after they were advised by the Cuban doctors to boil it before they could use it. The problems escalated when they experienced water shortages. The ablution facilities were of poor quality, and this contributed to hygiene concerns. Diseases such as malaria were also a great concern, and malaria claimed a number of lives. Owing to the shortage of facilities and/or supplies in the camps, those who fell ill were transferred and treated at other locations like Luanda. The government of Luanda made their facilities available to these comrades. Can we move to the next slide? Women who joined MK were not of the same age, and their priorities differed drastically. The priorities of the struggles of these three were distinct. You had the 1960 generation, the 1976 generation, the 1980s generation. They were not the same, and their experiences also differed. The generation of the 1960s fought for living wage. They fought against the past laws, and they used methods like bus boycotts to send the message to the government. The 1976 generation, which in MK also became known as the 1976 detachment, the nature of the struggle had changed, focusing their attention on fiscal engagement with the police, school boycotts, education charter campaign, and the destruction of the Bantu education system. The focus of the 1984 generation, called the Young Lions, was characterized by violence, including the use of the necklace to ban those who were considered not being on the side of the struggle. They used boycotts and calls for the resignation of councillors who were seen as supporters of the apartheid system. The different views with regard to the struggle were too wide to be breached, and the difference in views of these three generations of fighters was quite evident. But on account of the allegiance to the movement, these differences never came out into the open as conflicts. Can we move to the next slide? One other issue that had psychological effect on the women was when the SADF raided the camp in Angola. Although the commissars were available to offer help after the raid, and those that experienced what happened, they offered some form of counseling. It seemed there was a need for special counseling because the trauma was just too much to help the affected members to deal with the effects of that raid. Gloria Meek described one scene after the Air Force raid that she experienced when they attacked the camp as follows. One comrade's head was totally gone, and you couldn't pick up their bodies because you would try to pick them up and they would come off. So they had to be picked with spades. And the other comrade was shot in the chest and in the back, and he was also a mincemeat. That experience affected her badly. This is one memory she will forever carry in her heart. The journey thus was not paved in gold, but thorns. Like one of their songs that they used to sing, Inzima lendlela, inameva, iyahlaba, but will continue. In conclusion, women driven by a deep sense of injustice and a commitment to freedom played crucial roles as leaders, strategists, and symbols of resistance. Despite facing significant risks and societal marginalization, these women showed remarkable courage and resilience. Their sacrifices, I think you can move to the slide on conclusion, yes. Their sacrifices and contributions were instrumental in weakening the apartheid regime and bringing about the eventual dismantling of institutionalized racial segregation. In the broader narrative of South Africa's liberation, their legacy stands as a testament to the vital role in shaping the course of history and advancing the cause of justice and equality. Their stories must continue to inspire future generations to fight against all forms of oppression. As it is said in Sesotho languages, Mahongwana tshwara thipa ka bogaleng, meaning the mother grabs the knife by its blade. Indeed, with their bravery and courage, these women, irrespective of their age, they truly grab the knife by its sharp end. Some suffered severe cuts. They bled. The wound may have healed, but the scar remains. It is that scar that shall forever remain a stuck and a mark that woman too played a role in MK. As we celebrate and honor their contribution, let us not forget those who lost their lives in this noble cause. Their experiences remain in their hearts. Malibongwe igama la makosikazi.